Good morning, Year 12s. Today we're going to be looking at the poem called The Mirror, which is written from the perspective of a famous and very real Dutch painter called Jan Vermeer. Vermeer was famous for painting everyday moments within his household and within the city in which he lived, but these everyday moments were captured with intricate detail and absolute beauty. And we're going to have a look at how the visuals of his paintings are captured somewhat in the poem written by Rosemary Dobson. The Mirror. Jan Vermeer speaks. Time that is always gone stays still a moment in this quiet room. Nothing exists but what we know. The mirror gathers in the world, time and the world, and I shall hold all summers in a stroke of gold. Twilight and one last fall of sun that slants across the windowsill and mirrored darkly in the glass, can paint attempt that unlit void? All night oblivion is stayed within the curtain's folded shade. Upon the table bread and wine, the earthen pitcher's perfect curve once spun upon the potter's wheel is pivot of the turning world. Still centre where my peace abides, round moon that draws all restless tides. There it is done, the vision fades and time lives. O you who praise this wrangled broken web of paint, I paint reflections in a glass, who look on truth with mortal sight are blinded by its blaze of light. Alright, so here we see the ideas of the first two poems and the third poem starting to come together and being realised in a new style that Dobson is experimenting with here. In the first two poems, she was definitely examining the concept of time and the world between what we know and what we don't know, which comes up again in the first stanza. But she also is very fascinated with this idea of prolonging time or capturing a moment that would be lost to the progression of time, which we also see in the first stanza here. We also get to see that she is experimenting with visuals again within this poem. In the first two, it was more to do with movement and stillness and the possibilities that were within those movements and that juxtaposition. But here we start to see a juxtaposition of light and shade, which is something that she began in her previous poem. As you are rereading through this poem, I'd really like you to track the movement from light to dark, or dark to light, as it may be, and have a look at what that could potentially mean. Is that a metaphor for something? Chances are it probably is. We know that she is fascinated between the unrealised moments of life, those moments that are on the verge of something but never truly come to fruition. So in the earlier poems, she was perhaps talking about the moment between life and death, that she was talking about preserving a moment in the past. Here we get to see again, there's something that is on the verge. Here she talks about the unlit void and capturing an unlit void. What is an unlit void? What could it possibly be? Is it the moment of creation? Is it the moment of inspiration? We don't know, but these are questions you need to be asking yourself. We're going to focus now on the concept of the mirror and what a mirror represents. For Jan Vermeer, he painted what he saw, or what he thought he saw within his household. So often his paintings were of servants, of couples, of people within his household that were literally just doing everyday things. If you have a look at some of the paintings in the timeline document, you'll notice one that I think is called The Milkmaid, and she's a woman just pouring milk from a jug into a basin. There's nothing groundbreaking about his subject matter. There's nothing existential. There's nothing phenomenal that examines our very essence of why we're here. But what it does do is capture a moment that would have otherwise been lost. It captures a very small fragment of time in Jan Vermeer's Dutch household and preserves it forever. However, the concept of preserving something forever is and will always be entirely subjective. You may have touched upon this in your discussion or your analysis of the previous poems, but talking about painting, photography, poetry, whatever art form someone wishes to use to preserve a moment in time, it is entirely their opinion and their version of what was happening at that particular moment. They choose what angle to capture the moment from, they choose what words or colours to use to describe that moment, and it is that moment through that artist's eyes and that artist's perspective. So when we look at Jan Vermeer, it's very interesting that Dobson has chosen a very specific artist to look through the eyes of, and what she's actually trying to achieve by looking at this from his perspective. And this is where we start to get to the heart of this poem, I think, is where we look at the concept of Vermeer as an artist, but we also look at this concept of what a mirror means. That it does indeed gather in the world. A mirror reflects only what it can see within its frames and within its boundaries. Painting, poetry, whatever it might be, is very much the same. Whatever we choose to include within the boundaries of that particular artwork is what is then indeed reflected back. As much as we would like to consider it to be the truth, it is always going to be a version of the truth. And this is where she starts to consider this, where she says, nothing exists but what we know. And that's true. We have no proof that anything else beyond that exists, except we have a feeling. We want to believe that something exists beyond that. And so therefore we try to gather in what we know and preserve it for those who come later. So therefore we get another revision of the passing of time using light. So in the first poem we talked about the moon rising and falling. In the Ship of Ice we talked about the passing of time as the people stood on the deck of the ship and waited and waited and waited. Here, and we also got the imagery of the shadows lengthening in an afternoon and the fact that light represents the passing of time. Here we get that again, where we see twilight and the last fall of sun slanting across the windowsill, this idea that time is escaping us, that we hold on to the afternoon and the last rays of sunshine as the last moment of that particular day, but as much as we want to hold on to it, we can't actually stop it. So then we look at the eternal artist problem of trying to hold on to a moment. And in this case, it's all summers in a stroke of gold, so a stroke of gold paint. We could look at this as a straightforward story about a painter trying to capture a moment, or we could look at this as a metaphor for something. Is Vermeer trying to hold on to a memory or an emotion? Is he trying to hold on to his own inspiration before it slips away? What is it that he's actually trying to capture and hold here? It could very well be just that moment in time. It could be as straightforward as that. But when we start to look at this, can paint attempt that unlit void? We have to ask ourselves, what is that unlit void? What is that oblivion? So oblivion and void have echoes of emptiness, of darkness, of something that is completely incomprehensible to us. So here we can ask ourselves, is this the time between life and death? Is this our artistic inspiration? What is that unlit void? We also have a look then, we get this juxtaposition between this very existential, very honest reflection about the meaning of life, death, artistic creation, whatever it might be, with something that is very, very banal, very, very everyday, bread and wine and a jug sitting on a table. And this is where we start to see some absolute parallels between this poem and the artwork of Vermeer. Whilst Vermeer's work appears to be incredibly everyday, capturing a maid at work, it is actually a reflection of what it meant to exist at that particular time, of the very real subtleties that lay beneath the very simplistic seeming surface of these poems, of the paintings, I beg your pardon. So here we see the fact that something that seems very, very uninteresting, bread, wine, and a jug sitting on a table, that are just everyday functions of everyday life and would very possibly appear in lots of Vermeer's artwork, are instead the pivot of the turning world, the still centre where my peace abides. And here we get this lovely juxtaposition between the banal and the existential, the literal with the figurative. And this is where we start to question and draw parallels between Vermeer's work and that of Dobson and ask ourselves, is this the truth to life as we know it? We spend much of our days searching for that unlit void, that finding the truth and the meaning behind the oblivion, the stuff we don't know. Is Dobson, and is perhaps Vermeer, maybe starting to suggest that the truth behind all of our worries and our concerns actually lies within those most basic things of our everyday life: bread, wine, and the jug that we find on our table. And if we are looking at repetition of imagery and concepts from previous poems, we get again a juxtaposition between still and restless. So then we get a very self-deprecating final stanza here, where Vermeer, who is really Dobson, suggests that the moment of inspiration, or the afternoon, or whatever it might be that she's trying to capture, or he is trying to capture within this painting/poem, suggests that it's momentary and it's gone, it's done. That the vision fades and time moves on. That our opportunity to capture a moment is indeed small, momentary. Whether we are capturing our inspiration here, whatever it might be, it is for a very minuscule moment of time, and we have to work our hardest to capture it before it disappears. And then it begins to consider audience reaction to artwork and says, "O you who praise this wrangled broken web of paint, I paint reflections in a glass." They're saying that a lot of people get swept up in the artistry and the majesty of what it means to be a painter or an artist, and they only look at the surface. They look at the technique, at the paint on canvas, the physicality of it. But if they do, they're missing something incredibly vital, because what he/she is saying here is that all they're doing is painting a reflection. The artistry, the actual paint on canvas, is not the important part. The beauty of the paint is not the important part, because if you look at it from that perspective, you are in fact going to miss the essence of the piece of artwork. And that if we look at the painting or the poem or whatever form of artwork it might be, simply with mortal sight, looking at the superficial, the surface of a piece of artwork, we are going to be blinded by its beauty and forget to see the truth. Okay, so we haven't come to a conclusive understanding of this poem yet, but what I would like you to think about is the contrast between the everyday, banal, with the more existential discussion of what it means to be alive. And do we find a truth within those very basic everyday things? I would also like you to think about the juxtaposition between the superficial beauty of something and the truth that may be hidden behind it, and what we miss if we only look at the superficial beauty. In this way, I would like to draw your attention to the final couplets of each stanza. What do you notice at the very end of each couplet of each stanza? Of course, you'll notice that there is a rhyme there. Is this what we would expect from Dobson? If not, then why has she included this here? Think about drawing parallels between Vermeer's paintings and her artwork. Think about this concept here and think about what she may be attempting to say using form as an added layer of meaning.